Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's another worst to best ranking. This is something that I specifically wanted to do this month because December 2019 marks the 30th anniversary of the release of Orbital's debut single, Chime. Obviously I don't need to introduce this band on this channel, but in case this video is somehow your first exposure to my Orbital related content, Orbital are my favorite band of all time. Every single one of their albums means a lot to me, and not a single one of them is less than great in my opinion. They were the band that first started my obsession with all things electronic music and have shaped and defined my taste like no other band out there. I've already reviewed every single one of their albums, including Paul and Phil's various solo projects and their soundtrack work. I did a video counting down my 20 favorite tracks of theirs. All that is in a playlist which will be linked in the description. Obviously, now that worst to best rankings are a regular part of my channel, one had to happen to Orbital sooner or later. So here it is. Before I begin, a couple of disclaimers. First of all, this video is just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. It's just based on my own personal enjoyment and that's about it. Liable to change based on my mood, though this really was not all that difficult to put together, believe it or not. There may be rankings here that go against the typical grain. If you don't like it, then make your own ranking. I do still love all 9 albums highlighted here. Also, yes, I'm only ranking the 9 Orbital studio albums in this video. No solo projects or soundtracks or anything like that. I could include those if I wanted to, but I wanted to put this video out a little more quickly. TLDR thoughts, check out 858, the Octane soundtrack, and Long Range Madness and Me. So, may as well get into it. This is Orbital, worst to best. At number 9, I have Wonky. So, since around September of last year, for whatever reason, this album's kinda shrunk on me a fair bit. I wonder why. Now don't get me wrong, I still love this album, and the final 2 tracks on here are still among my favorites of Orbital's entire career. I think it's cool that Orbital basically have this album that takes a lot of cues from trendy EDM sounds of the time, but they still find a way to make it their own, and hit on the core appeal of all those sounds. Their modern dubstep remake of Satan, for instance. Not difficult to figure out about when it came out, but it still kicks ass in the way that both that genre and the original Satan should. Surely the album that I half-named my channel after and own 2 t-shirts of still holds up to some extent. But on the whole, it is almost certainly their weakest crop of tracks. The title track and Where Is It Going aside, none of the other tracks here really rise to become particular favorites of mine from their entire career. It has a particularly underwhelming opener and one big moment, almost certainly the worst opener of any Orbital album. It has their single Never, which is one of the blandest tracks they've ever put out, and most of the quirkier tracks don't have the same amount of personality that weirder highlights from older albums do. See Straight Sun or Distractions. Stringy Acid holds up though, that one's still good. And New France is still a pretty solid single, if not their most interesting track either. This album was more frustrating when I thought it was going to be their final album, because it did not feel like a send-off. It felt like a comeback, an attempt to find their footing again and re-energize themselves, a stepping stone towards bigger and better things. And the bigger and better things have started to happen now, so that complaint obviously no longer applies, but now this album just feels a lot weaker in comparison. I still think the trendiness of this album isn't nearly as cringeworthy a look for them as one might expect. They still did these sounds well, but the best Orbital albums can't be compared to the time they were released. They stand as timeless classics all on their own, and this album is not that. It seems to age worse and worse the more time passes by it, and just has a lot of their least interesting tracks. And speaking of non-timeless albums, whoopsh, at number 8, I have the Green Album. Orbital's self-titled debut from 1991 very much sounds like a product of its time, and I would argue it's even significantly more of a product of its time than Wonky. This album is just synonymous with the 90s and the dawn of the rave and ecstasy era, and with much less of the refinement and focus found on later projects. They were still kind of establishing their identity at this point, and a lot of the tunes just aren't there. Many moments on here feel kind of basic and aren't doing enough to set themselves apart from the sounds of the time. Granted, they do have the excuse of nobody really doing these sounds yet at the time. The closest thing you had was probably 808 States 90. Green Album feels like it was helping invent the sounds and formulas that became commonplace and so closely associated with this era in particular. A bigger complaint I have with this album is that it has very few of my favorite moments from them ever. There's a lot of tracks that feel like aimless sketches. Speed Freak in particular just tends to leave me cold. And much of this album is only good to me and not great. Even well-known singles like Belfast, well, really just that one. Not really sure why that one never did more for me. But this album's run of Fahrenheit 303, Steel Cube Idolatry, High Rise, Chime Live, and Midnight Live is absolutely fantastic. And if you get the US version of the album, you may lose that whole run, but you get the 8-minute edit of Chime and the original version of Satan, the two best versions of those old classic singles. Oh yeah, and the Mobius, that one's great too. Totally whacked out track and one that only Orbital could have possibly done. Ulan Desert Stormer. And they're good. Still a really solid album with its own cohesive sound, and aside from Speed Freak just being okay, everything is at least good. But I think it's been topped. All my above-mentioned criticisms aside, it doesn't get quite as strong a visceral reaction out of me that most Orbital albums can. If you want an album that gets more of a visceral reaction out of me, you got this one. Whoopsh. At number 7, I have the Blue Album. The Blue Album is a tricky one to quantify because in one breath, I don't think this was an album that mattered a particular amount to them. I think after the Altogether flopped, they decided they weren't needed anymore or something, threw together a handful of leftover ideas and fleshed them out, put them out as a swan song for their career. Quit while they were ahead, I suppose. Well, maybe it's a little harsh to insinuate they weren't trying on this one, but its scattershot presentation and half committing to a sort of overarching vibe and then giving up in the last third made me feel like it's probably lower effort than some of their other projects. On the other hand, this album also gets a massive bonus from pure childhood nostalgia. Because this was the first CD I ever bought with my own money. I listened to it so much as a middle schooler, the copy I own is no longer playable. It's an album that resonates with me emotionally stronger than most Orbital albums, and one I'm fairly certain was intended that way. And yeah, I mentioned the lack of cohesion, but even with that in mind, this album's individual tracks do still add up to one of their smoothest, most cinematic album experiences that is very easy to get myself immersed in. It starts and ends with two of their most emotionally potent tracks, the haunting and menacing classical-leaning stylings of Transient, and freaking One Perfect Sunrise, which absolutely would have been the perfect track to end their career on if they wanted to do that. Just such an unbelievable burst of joy and sadness and so much emotion that I have like no words for. And that downbeat vibe they do create for the first 2/3 of the album is still really well done, and even when Acid Pants and Easy Serve throw that all out the window, I've still listened to it so much over the years that they don't actually feel jarring at all. I don't know, this album is probably carried by personal nostalgia first and foremost. It was so life-changing as a little kid, and still gives me the same kinds of chills it did when I was 12 or 13. But I also probably don't have as much respect for it as some of the other ones, or feel like it's one of the best demonstrations of what makes Orbital great. It's one of those where I'm like, if this wasn't up to snuff for you, I get it. If you want an album I have more respect for, there's the next pick. Whoopsh. At number 6, I have Monsters Exist. Wonky felt like the album where Orbital were celebrating being back in the game, but Monsters Exist felt like the album where Orbital meant business. This isn't a tease anymore, we're really trying now, we're gonna deliver a political album, make every song count. It felt like the Orbital album with the most thought put into it in a very long time. I love the way it comes together as a whole and they make every track fit the theme in some way, be it the fairly loose atmospheric tie-ins like Buried Deep Within and Vision on E, to the much more conceptual tracks than that whole run in the first half. A track like Hoo Hoo Ha Ha doesn't work nearly as well if you don't follow it up with The Raid, the barely contained ridiculous lie ripped off revealing the dark truth underneath, and that placement further cements the fake cheeriness of PHUK, their big 7-minute anti-Brexit statement, musically symbolizing pretending this problem doesn't exist, and getting more and more rickety and unstable as it goes on as their country tumbled towards the cliff edge. And following it up with the striking dystopian tones of tiny foldable cities. All genius moves if you ask me. Presented in such a way that's completely unlike anyone else on the scene would have done, yet still creating tracks that are fun, danceable, catchy and don't wear out with repeat listens. And yes, The End Is Nigh is still easily my favorite track in the bunch. I don't care if some people were turned off by that one and its bright, flashy, glitch mob-esque tones, but it still kicks so much ass. When the bass comes in under that main chord progression, it's like the entire earth is shaking. And my opinion on the track was further cemented by seeing it live myself and them sticking it in the encore after Chime and Where's It Going, and I thought they were gonna leave without doing it, but fuck me, there it is. Like they were waiting on it especially for me. Hell, seeing them live in person for the first time is going to forever cement Monsters Exist in my mind as such a special moment since they played so many tracks on this album that night. And yet, it's still in the bottom half. I do still have my problems. For one thing, I think this album has easily the weakest ending of any Orbital album. Input Out doesn't count. There will come a time with Brian Cox as good as like a thought-provoking intellectual exercise and is fitting as a closer from like a conceptual level, but musically it's quite underwhelming and is a few steps away from just being a pure spoken word piece. Orbital's instrumental just isn't that great or attention-grabbing. I kinda tend to tap out when it comes up. Hell, I often just skip it. There's also the fact that the album's really short, really left me hungering for more, and the collection of what sounds like unfinished demos they added as bonus tracks don't really help in that way. And there's no track on here that just feels like it's this monumental standout moment for them. The End Is Nigh comes close for me, but it's still only like 4.5 minutes. It's basically a fragment compared to the size and importance of tracks like Halcyon or Out There Somewhere or Are We Here or One Perfect Sunrise, or hell, even Wonky or Where Is It Going? Maybe it's because I feel weirdly alone in my love for The End Is Nigh. It's not the kind of track that feels like it's gonna bring all the fans together or something. It was a weird track that stuck out like a sore thumb and ended up being pretty controversial. And the whole album is pretty controversial. Some people hated it, think it's the worst thing they've ever done. Some people think it's the best thing they've ever done. Me, I'm obviously in neither category. These guys had a run of 5 albums in a row that just hit this transcendental level for me, and this album was the closest they've ever come to hitting that level again since, but they didn't quite reach that level. Came up just a tiny bit short. But may as well go into that run of 5 albums that did hit that level for me. Whoopsh. At number 5, I have The Middle of Nowhere. The Middle of Nowhere. Not enough people talk about this one. I've heard there were people who thought this album was a letdown after Insides, though I suppose anything would be. This album is still incredible and just takes me on a journey. It's one of the most cohesive and seamless projects in their catalog. It all fits together super well. It's got the epic extended track lengths that I like out of them. No meager 4 or 5 minute pieces here. Well, okay, Otonio's about 5 minutes, but they scale upward pretty quickly. 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes, a 15-minute track split into 2 parts. These are the kind of track lengths that I've been wishing for Orbital to go back to. It's got the epic standouts like Nothing Left in Spare Parts Express. The latter was the first Orbital track I've ever heard. It's got tons of hard-hitting deep cuts like Nowhere to Run, I Don't Know You People, or Otonio. It starts strongly with Way Out, it ends satisfyingly with style. I've basically got nothing to complain about here. Maybe other Orbital albums went the extra mile more than this one, took more risks, feel more like big iconic moments, but this album is probably their single tightest and most well-structured set of tracks. It still has an unmistakable identity in their catalog that doesn't sound like any of their other albums. It's still freaking great, and pretty damn underrated if you ask me. And speaking of underrated projects with an unmistakable identity, whoosh, at number 4, I have The Altogether. Yeah, I'm gonna continue to stand by this one. This one seems to be widely regarded as the point at which Orbital just fell off and never recovered. Even Paul and Phil themselves don't seem to like it much. Which is a real shame because I think it's absolutely brilliant. Not to say I don't get the hate to some regard. This album is completely all over the place sonically and goes out of its way to not let any vibe develop. It's quite a mess. There's also only one track that breaks the 6-minute barrier. Not to mention this is also easily Orbital's least serious album. It's absolutely ridiculous and silly and cheesy all the way through. You could even say it was a joke album and you wouldn't be wrong. Fairly certain Paul even called it that himself. But as ridiculous as this album was, you cannot possibly convince me that they half-assed it. They were going out of their way to be weird and crazy and off the wall. They made the album a mess entirely on purpose. They outright avoided any 2 adjacent tracks sounding similar in any way or forming any sort of segue. making every transition jarring, and yet somehow ordering them in such a way that is still kind of symmetrical and consistently paced. The result is the most insane roller coaster ride of an album they've ever done. Complete opposite of the Middle of Nowhere's streamlined, seamless, cohesive feel. This one they were just going completely nuts, and it is just so much freaking fun to listen to. No album of theirs has ever matched the unbridled balls-to-the-wall insanity of tracks like Tension and Meltdown and Waving Not Drowning and Oi, and they contrasted heavily with the shiny, poppy, almost radio-friendly singles like Funny Break and Illuminate. That one, Illuminate in particular, I get a few hate because that is such a radio single. Or more laid back but still heavily quirky moments like Pay-Per-View and Shadows. Oh yeah, and there's the cover of the Doctor Who theme that's absolutely badass and has continued to be a live staple in their shows. Saw it myself, pretty awesome. I'm glad at least one track from this album stuck around in their sets. But yeah, this album was one hell of a risky move. It's a pretty big change in direction. I respect it all the more for that. But even as a kid who didn't know about its critical reception, this album's energy and craziness and abundance of catchy and creative songs that stuck in my brain just had me eating this up without a second thought. This album may be really different from their usual stuff, but it's still freaking amazing, and I personally hold it up just as high as their classic material. Seriously think people have to give it another chance. Anyways, now it's time to talk about the classic material. At number 3 I have Snivilisation. I always used to be pretty on and off with Snivilisation, but as society at large seems to go further and further down the shitter and my faith in the systems of this freaking country become increasingly non-existent, this album seems to hit the spot more and more. Like Monsters Exist, Snivilisation is a bitter and angry political album, but one that's a lot more sprawling and detailed. Feels like it has more to say. I used to feel like the first half of this album was a little tinny and dry and unpleasant, even if probably intentional. But the harsh bitterness of tracks like I Wish I Had Duck Feet and Sad But True and Philosophy by Numbers now just kinda seems to fit the mood of the world these days. And tracks like Crash and Carry and Quality Seconds channel their anger at the world into some real, visceral, raging energy. And that's also not including tracks I already liked before, like Forever and Science Friction, which had all their quirky sensibilities in a fairly laid-back context. The former is another recent grower. And of course the second half of this album, which has 3 longtime favorites from them that I've never gotten sick of. The upbeat and playful piano banging of Kein Trink Wasser, the beautiful nostalgic fuzziness of The Closer Attached, and of course Are We Here, which seems to combine every great quality of all the other tracks on the album into an incredible, ridiculously hard-hitting, and amazing-sounding 15-minute masterpiece. What I wouldn't give to get a track like that out of Orbital again. Even at the absolute lowest point of my personal enjoyment of Snivilisation, I've still always loved it, and it's especially felt relevant and necessary as of late. But of course, there's 2 more albums I hold above it and have gotten into a lot more consistently than this one, and well, they're exactly the 2 you think they are, but let's talk about them. At number 2, I have the Brown Album. Well, there really isn't much to say about this one. It's the big iconic one, it's got all their most recognizable songs, Lush, Impact, Halcyon. We all know them well. It's got plenty of textured and hard-hitting deep cuts like Planet of the Shapes and Walk Now and Monday. Every track has a distinct identity and feel like they all link together in a relatively seamless fashion. It's flawlessly produced from start to finish. I'm kind of at a loss for words with this album, not only because it's so inextricably linked to my childhood, hearing Halcyon, Planet of the Shapes, and Walk Now as a 12-year-old was so formative to starting my journey into the world of electronic music and why I've committed myself to the genre so much. It's the kind of album that makes me feel like a kid again listening to it, and I'm only 24. The only critique I could possibly have is that Input Out kills Halcyon's mood. And yeah, that's all I got. Let's finish the ranking. At number 1, I have Insides. Well, here we are. Not just my favorite Orbital album, but also my favorite album of all time. There's not a single quality about this album that I don't find pretty much completely flawless. Not only does it have a strong childhood connection, hell, it's an album that was so powerful that when I first heard it as a kid, I was outright scared by it. It's an emotional roller coaster with so much melody, color, detail, and texture that it lives up to its insane album cover. 6 tracks that go on for eye-catching lengths but justify every second. Don't feel either too long or too short. The album starts with a 10-minute slow-building burst of pure joy, immediately contrasts it with a 6-minute dip into the dirtiest and ugliest depths, followed by a 2-parter piece showing a similar contrast with a sparkling but mildly unnerving first half and a dark, hard-hitting climactic second half. And in the second half of the album, it somehow gets even better, with one piece that seems to evoke the coldness and darkness of the outer reaches of the galaxy, one piece that starts out all quirky and odd and goofy but builds up into these ethereal, haunting, gleaming melodies and makes it all work together, and the grand orchestral tinged 24-minute 2-part finale which evokes what it would be like if you were abducted by aliens and the aliens took you to heaven. By the end, I feel like I've ascended into a higher plane of existence. I don't even need to name any of these tracks, you know them. And I didn't even mention how the album ties up everything under its environmental themes for the extra cherry on top, like how the opener was made using only solar power, and one track's title is Welsh for dirty water, or just the title of the second track is pretty self-explanatory. Not much else to say. This is their timeless masterpiece, and one of the greatest examples of all that electronic music is capable of. I don't think anyone, including Orbital themselves, are ever going to be able to top this one for me. Orbital's insides, still greatest of all time. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.